there was a feeling that again, there were problems in the design of tall buildings which were not being addressed properly with other organizations. And most of these were, I'm going to call them, of an interdisciplinary nature. That take elevatoring, for instance. There's the elevatoring, there's elevatoring related to planning and how the core is developed, also highly objectively related to the structural performance of the building. And the taller you get, the more important that issue becomes. How does the building move, and how do you accommodate that within the shaft and the elevatoring design? So it was those kinds of exterior walls, same thing. Building moves a lot, taller the building. How do you accommodate it in the design of the exterior wall? It involves the architects, it involves the structural engineers, it involves the mechanical engineers in terms of its energy, abilities. So I think it was these interdisciplinary kinds of topics that were at least one of the major impetuses for the formation of the committee. They felt that if we got these professionals together in one place, that we could begin to try and understand what were the impacts of these issues to resolve that problem. When CCHRB started, it was about at that same time that the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat was founded. And they were a more international focus group, even back at the beginning, whereas the Chicago Committee was pretty much focused in Chicago. But the Council on Tall Buildings in 1987, actually, or maybe even 86, decided that their third World Congress would be in Chicago. And we had developed, the Chicago Committee had developed a kind of a relationship with the Council on Tall Buildings. And so they asked if the Chicago Committee would host, so to speak, this World Congress and organize it and do it. And I was selected as the chairman of that committee to do that. So we had this week-long Congress here in Chicago, the first week in January, which was an interesting time of the year to bring people to Chicago. Fortunately, the weather was reasonably good, and it was the largest attendance of the previous two World Congresses. One had been in Lehigh and one in Paris. This one far surpassed that. If I remember right, there were like 550 registrants. It was a good opportunity for the Chicago Committee to gain a lot of exposure around the world, because everybody knew that the Chicago Committee was organizing this event, and it went off very well, and I think it was a real kind of feather in our cap. Well, the cladding seminar, again, was a result of people feeling that we needed to get together the whole community, the whole design community, to present, so to speak, the state of the art of where we were in terms of cladding design, and what were some of the problems that still exist, and how do we pursue them. So, and this wasn't just a Chicago thing. It was a Chicago issue that we were bringing up, but we wanted to address it worldwide. So we had people participating from many different places around the world, and we had participants from Europe and various places. So I think it was a very important conference. It was a 2-day conference. And when we finished, everyone felt that it was so successful that we should do it again. This was only step one. Let's do it again, and in 5 years or 4 years. Well, unfortunately, the early 90s were a downer in terms of the economy and in terms of buildings, and somehow it never happened. But that conference, I think, was a very important conference that resulted in a very, as Peter said, a very nice publication that summarized everything that we had talked about in that conference. I think the committee over the years has been involved both directly and indirectly, let's say, with education. Many of our members are traveling constantly to universities and various organizations to make presentations and give talks and to distribute some of the information that we've developed as a committee. But one of the biggest efforts that we have is there was a committee formed within a subcommittee within our committee called the Tang Committee, which was named for a professor down at the University of Illinois in the architecture department who taught structural engineering. And this committee put together a course, a 3-hour credit course in the architecture program that dealt with, I'm going to call it the life of a project. And this went from the very initial thinking by the developer through the various design phases, through the working drawings, through the construction administration. We would have field trips to look at a couple of projects and show students what was occurring on site, and it dealt with legal matters, it dealt with commissioning of the building, dealt with mechanical, electrical, plumbing issues, the full spectrum of what is a project, because that's something we've never found in a program. They teach design and engineering and all these specific issues, but nobody ever puts it together so the student can see just what are they going to be facing when they get out in the real world. So this course was taught for 16 consecutive years at the University of Illinois. It was their most popular course down there. The students would fill it immediately when they had the opportunity during registration. And I think it was a very successful course. I was always amazed at how people like Clyde and Sherwin and Ellie Cohen treated me as an equal, as somebody, and so I felt very fortunate to be in the room, so to speak, with these people and discussing these issues. It was a very big benefit for me in my career. Foz was an amazing person. He was certainly the most brilliant engineer that I've ever met and dealt with. Very innovative, very forward-thinking in terms of looking at not only the structure but the building as a whole. In fact, he could talk to anyone about anything. He was that kind of a person. He knew about music. He knew about art. He knew about science. He just was a kind of a broad spectrum person, in addition to being this brilliant engineer. And so he had a way of being able to relate to people and to talk with them. And it was that ability, I think, that allowed him to do some of the innovative things he did. He would always tell me that, there's a lot of good engineers around, a lot of brilliant engineers, they have great ideas, but they can't sell them. They can't relate to the architects and tell them how, that structural system is going to benefit them. So they lose it. And he didn't lose it. He was able to sell his ideas and relate to architects and relate to mechanical engineers and all these other people, and relate to owners. An owner, when Foz was involved in a project, I think the owner began to feel like he was actually one of the owners of the project. I mean, he just had that ability to relate to it. And one good example I have of that is we were doing a very unusual project in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, the Hajj Terminal. Very innovative, had never been done before, and we had a big meeting in New York, our New York office, and General Amin was there, who was in charge of the project for Saudi Arabia. And we met all day, and we came out for a break. And of course, it was very tense for General Amin, because he had to make a decision whether we were going to go ahead with that design or not. And he turned to Foz and he said, "What do you think I should do?" And Foz says, "I would take it." That's all he said. We went back in the room, project proceeded. So Foz had that kind of ability to do fantastic things. Following the downturn of construction, tall building construction in particular, in the early 90s, things began to pick up in the middle 90s to late 90s. And one of the first projects that we at SOM experienced in this turnaround was our Jinmao project in China. This signaled the beginning for us, but not only us, I think it was a lot of firms in the U.S. began to work, particularly on tall buildings, in China. The work was very needed, so to speak, if they were going to expand their economy and their culture. And so I think all of the things that we had learned, not only in Chicago, but other places in the U.S., all of this technology and all of these problems that we had solved, so to speak, were put to good use then when we went to the Far East in particular, and then eventually in the Middle East. This tall building technology was very applicable to their needs in those places. If you look at the population of most countries around the world, whether it's an underdeveloped country or a developed country, the urban areas are getting bigger and bigger, and the rural areas are less and less. So I think most urban areas are growing, and I think there will be, a push to go taller as land values increase. So I think the future, and when you see countries like China and the Middle East in various places, there are probably different reasons for it, but particularly China, there's urban areas there that we've never heard of that have 6-8 million people. And I think it's those kinds of pressures that are going to result in tall buildings. And as we see in China, there are many tall buildings built every year. So I see that as a future. I don't think that's going to change.